Dr. John Bruni from Sage International. How are you?
Good morning, Jeremy. How are you?
I'm well. I wasn't sure whether you were coming into the studio or I was going to ring you.
Oh, look, I am so sorry about that. We have a little bit of school holiday chaos down here, and it kind of let
I remember
slip.
that. I remember school chaos.
You know, when you have young kids, what are you going to do?
Yeah. How many have you got?
2.
Yeah, girl and a boy?
Daughter and son. Yeah, girl and boy.
That's wonderful.
And what age, John?
So we're looking at 13 and 11.
You got the troublesome years ahead of you.
I know. All of my friends who have certainly passed through the small children phase of their respective lives are all warning me about it. So yes.
And John, do they have mobile phones, your kids?
Oh my God, they have devices. Don't get me started. We will have a totally different discussion as to the one that you want to have with me.
Well, look, there's so much stuff, unfortunately, going on in the world.
For sure.
Let's start with China firing an ICBM into the Pacific for apparently no reason. What was all that about?
Well, they're testing their weapons. They're also signaling to the United States that they have the capacity to potentially reach the continental United States should things get hairy over places like Taiwan, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, or any of the areas that they may have ambitions to dominate. So really, it's a two-pronged thing. So the first thing is to there is an actual need to test in real time the capacities of their weaponry. And I think following on from the sinking of their first-of-class nuclear submarine recently, there was an urgency and a need to demonstrate to the world that Chinese productive capacities in defense merchandise, if you will, is not as bad as has been pontificated on the media many, many times. And, again, it is there for trying to save face more than anything else, but also to signal to the Americans that, look, you may think that we can't do anything, but we actually can, and this is the effect,
Yeah, and does that same logic apply to Korea as well, North Korea?
Well, North Korea also has a very real need. They don't have, computers and digital means of being able to test their equipment. And the North Koreans are much more belligerent than the Chinese ever will be. So for them, again, it's a signal and also a very practical way of showing their wherewithal working in real time. Many of the kind of tests that we in the West have for a lot of these things are on landlocked test ranges. I mean, here in Australia, we've got a couple of the largest ones in the world. In the United States, they've got the White Sands facility, and it's all within the continental confines. So it doesn't necessarily spill off into the international domain, like the seas, for instance. China and North Korea, but North Korea in particular, don't have such large test ranges. So they really have to test their missiles into the sea, which of course being right next to South Korea and Japan, and that's not necessarily a great look. There you go.
Just saber rattling, I suppose it is, but it
is. In a way, it is, but it also serves a practical reason for them.
Yeah, I suppose. What do you make of the federal government paying, I don't know, millions and millions of dollars to fly people who have been warned to leave Lebanon? And as they wait till the last moment, their decision, their choice, it falls upon the taxpayer to rescue them. Now, does that make any sense to you?
Well, this is the perils and pitfalls of running a foreign policy based on multiculturalism and playing ethnic politics, in Australia. We do have a very large contingent of Arab/Muslim/Lebanese /Middle Eastern people living here in Australia, and then we also have an equally influential body of people of Jewish descent, and they still maintain their ties to the homeland. Now, because we've allowed that genie out of the bottle, effectively, it means that the government of the day, whoever it happens to be, whether it's Dutton and the Liberal Party or Albanese and the Labor Party, it doesn't really matter. This cuts across party lines now. Every major political party now looks at their ethnic constituents as part of their, overarching electoral fortunes, if you will.
They want their votes.
They want their votes, and exactly right. So if that means that they have to evacuate people en masse from a place that they've been, warned off because of the potential for conflict, that is the price that the government of the day is willing to pay. Not necessarily the Australian people as a whole, but certainly the government is prepared to pay that price in the hope that as the next election comes along and these people are still resident in Australia, they will vote favourably for the party that allowed them to escape.
And an example of that, John, is that Jason St Clair's Labor electorate of Blaxland, 30% of the constituents are Muslim, so he's not going to say too much against those constituents and not
Correct.
Too much good for Israel.
Yeah, and look, Les, the other thing too is that the reality, whether we like to admit to it or not, is that we do have a multicultural society, and governments do play these games in order to, prepare themselves for the next bout of electioneering. And if we aren't sober in our minds with regard to the effects that this is going to have on our foreign policy position and also our domestic political position for political parties in particular playing this game, we're going to end up having some problems down the track when things get even more intense. For, if you will, for the whole Middle East to just go up in flames. Imagine all of the migrants from those countries who have successfully made homes here in Australia all getting very agitated by, the conflicts in their ancient homelands and being mobilised on the streets of Australian cities. Now, many Australians who don't buy into that will take umbrage, but the government of the day will look at this as serious protesting, and they'll have to take that under consideration, because if they alienate the Lebanese vote or the Jewish vote or whatever vote that they're hoping to garner, into the future, it really could cost them when it comes to a federal election. So, yeah.
And interesting enough, John, last night on the late debate, Liz Storer made a comment, and I think she reflecting on how people view the conflict in the Middle East. That, for example, she made the comparison between us in the Western civilization versus they in their civilization. The way we view this through the prism, their prism or our prism, is quite different. Like, they would think Western tyranny and colonisation is the root cause of all this, whereas we see it quite differently from our point of view. And this is the problem where never the twain shall meet. And if you listen to the protesters, whether it be in Adelaide or any Australian capital city, the protesters against Israel, they're using the terms genocide and all sorts of tyrannical type words. But that's their view, because that's how they see things. And that's the problem I think we face, John, because we're just not looking at things in the same way.
Well, Liz, we live in a democracy. People are going to be saying, well, what about my free speech? But then everyone else is going to say, well, what about my free speech? And then, of course, we end up having intercommunal instability and violence. We'll end up having, the problems of representing these ancient and irreconcilable conflicts taking place in Australia. And a lot of this wouldn't have happened. And this is something that a friend of mine and I were having a discussion with recently. A lot of this would not have happened had we not had the advent of social media and also the shrinkage of the world. Our transport networks allow us to fly in a matter of hours to distant parts of the world, allowing groups that had migrated to a new country like Australia, the United States, New Zealand, wherever, to keep in very close contact with relatives. You don't have to wait for a ship to deliver a letter 4 weeks after it's been written, which means that there's a time lag and, things move on in real time in the various places. So people lose contact over a period of time when there is a time lag. Now, if cousin Joe is, in Beirut and the missiles and rockets are raining on his head, you know about it, and it's a visceral sensation. It's like you are there. So in that case, the shrinkage of the world in the social media sense and in the transportation sense means that there is no breath that can be taken between the new migrants coming into this country and their ancient conflicts in the countries of old, the countries that they've just departed from. So those conflicts...
Their conflicts and their hatreds and all the rest become ours.
Yes, they do. And this is in real time now. And again, if we talk about patterns of migration as a consequence of that, let's take the controversy of we've got too many people coming in from all sorts of the world, all parts of the world aside for the moment. That's a different sort of thing that I'm talking about right now. What I'm talking about is migration was never a problem until social media and the jet age transformed everything and made the world much smaller. And so communication between distant parts of the globe, take place in minutes, hours, and sometimes even seconds, whereas before it took, months and weeks and perhaps even years in some instances. So I don't think that the technology levels that we have currently are helping multicultural Australia meld into one society. Yes. Basically, multiculturalism coupled to social media and the transport revolution have meant that your beef in a village in Afghanistan, many thousands of kilometres away from Australia, becomes a real-time issue in Adelaide between groups that have been fighting for centuries, in that same old country, so it's what are you going to do about that? You can't stop the jets and you can't stop social media, but the governments who enter this for political and electoral reasons, what they have to do is understand that this is the reality that they're dealing with and come up with some sort of policy prescription. Lord knows what that will be, because that would take a level of imagination that our politicians simply don't have.
And John, on that subject, and just changing direction slightly, and this is not in the media by any stretch of the imagination, what I'm about to say, but I do understand that in the Middle East itself, I mean, Iran is not necessarily, and let's not say Iran, but Hezbollah is not necessarily viewed with a great deal of endearment from its neighbours. And secretly, the neighbouring countries are all somewhat in support of Israel to rout out Hezbollah from Iran. Now, you're the expert in the field and the analyst. Is this something that is actually, what I'm saying, a correct theme?
Look, Les, it's complicated, but it's correct. Generally, I would say that is true. The Iranians, and here you have to excuse me for a moment, because I'm going to have to talk about a couple of things that can be construed as complicated overlays. But if we imagine Iran as an octopus, which it isn't, but just imagine, for instance, that it is, and it has its tentacles in Hezbollah. Hezbollah is like a puppet of Iran. Hamas is like a puppet of Iran. The Houthis are like a puppet of Iran. The idea of being able to contain Iran is a very popular idea among, say, the Gulf states. They don't like the Iranians very much. I mean, there was remember the Saudi Arabians had been hit by an Iranian missile and drone strike back in 2019 that took out 2 oil production facilities, and everyone was hitting the panic button at that stage. But that showed Iran's intent to cause damage very close to it. Saudi Arabia is much closer to Iran than Israel is, for instance. So its missiles and drones will have more of a greater effect on a Gulf state than it will ever have on Israel. Similarly, I think in January 2022, if memory serves me correctly, the UAE capital of Abu Dhabi had been hit by Iranian-made but Houthi-operated drones and missiles as well, in a much lesser-known attack. Now, the fact is, these are problems that the Gulf state monarchies know that they have to get rid of, and they buy into the narrative that Iran is the octopus and the Houthis and Hamas and Hezbollah are its little tentacles doing its bidding all over the place. The relationship between these parties, however, the so-called axis of resistance run by Iran, is a far more complex and nuanced one than the mainstream media and most other analysts will claim. And the reason why that is because Hamas is a political party and militant organization representing Sunni Palestinian rights in Gaza. That's a very narrow focus for them. Do they accept weapons from Iran? Absolutely. No one else is selling them weapons. No one else is willing to buy into going against Israel, but the Iranians are. So there is a mutual convenience to that a relationship, which no one really wants to sort of say, because if they do, then they give a lie to the whole notion of Iran being the center of this octopus kind of situation where its tentacles mean that Hamas is a puppet. It is not a puppet. Similarly, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, it is a repressive organization, even for those Shiite Lebanese who live under its domain. But, it is a political party, and it is a very powerful one. Its armed forces are stronger than the armed forces of the Lebanese state. The Lebanese state is corrupt and weak, and basically it's sort of like an urbanized Afghanistan. You've got your Christians, your Druze, your Shiites, you've got various other, and all those guys. They've all been hammering each other for freaking years. The fact that they still have a Lebanese map is amazing, because the Lebanese are a very conflict-prone people in many ways.
Is it true, John? Is it true that the armed forces, the army, the Lebanese army, is not involved in any of this chaos at all? They're
not
keeping
yet.
Their distance?
Not as far as we know, Jeremy. No, the Lebanese army is a very weak institution. Hezbollah is far more powerful, and Hezbollah, you would say, would represent about a third of the population of Lebanon, because about a third of the population of Lebanon are Shiite Lebanese. Now, again, if we go back to the relationship between Hezbollah and Iran, yes, Hezbollah shares Shiite theology with Iran. But remember, the central thing in a Middle Eastern area isn't just the religion, it's whether or not you are ethnically the same as, your sponsor. Now, the Shiites of Lebanon are Arab, right? Now, that may mean nothing to any one of us here in Australia, but it bloody hell means something to the folk living in the Middle East, where, conflicts go back centuries, they trace bloodlines to great-great-great-grandfathers. They know exactly whether or not a Sunni had married a Shiite 5 generations previous. These things matter, and the Iranians, they may hold Hezbollah in far greater stead in terms of, of all the axis of resistance players that have a closer relationship with Hezbollah than they would ever have with Hamas, being a Sunni-based organization. But, it's just the way it is. And the Houthis, again, people say, well, the Houthis are Shiite. They're not Shiite like the Iranians are Shiite. So that puts them back down on the pegging order of order of priority for support. The Houthis are Arab, first and foremost, and they believe in a different variant of Shiism, if you will. Yeah. So they're useful for Iran, but they're not, losing the Houthis for Iran is not, it's an inconvenience, but it doesn't break their foreign policy completely,
Wouldn't you think that the people, the ordinary people in the street, would resent being used and having their country taken over and used for the purposes of another nation?
And can I just add to Jeremy's comments, John? Aren't the Iranian people quite fed up with the mullahs over there, with the way they're running the show?
Absolutely. But the thing is, let us not make that the big deal that it should be, because the opposition groups in places like in the southern Lebanon, or in southern Lebanon, I should say, or in Iran or in Yemen, they are disorganized. They have no capacity to push back. When they have the government or the group that controls the government, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, or Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, they'll crack down, and they'll crack down brutally on anything that is conceived of as being a dissent. Right? These groups are not democracies, and they don't have the love of their people. They are useful conveniences in many ways, like Hamas, for instance. Hamas is the only form of government that Gaza has, because it was never allowed to have any form of government other than Hamas. So that's a problem in and of itself, right?
Yeah, that's a terrible mess. But just quickly, last question: Do you see us heading for a much bigger war in the Middle East now?
It's possible, but I think at the moment we should be relatively safe from that. There are too many people who want to not have that happen. So there is international pressure to try to contain the violence. But, look, will it work? Who knows?
But Israel is actually making progress, though, isn't it? On a general sense.
Well, Israel has declared its hand, and this is something that, again, it's an interesting fact. October the 7th, all of Israel's so-called intelligence superiority, which it's demonstrated recently by decapitating the leadership of Hezbollah, those guys were somehow asleep, stood down, or whatever, because October 7th happened. Had they not been, absent, they would have easily been able to take care of the Hamas attack at that time, and it would not have been a Hamas invasion of southern Israel. It just wouldn't have happened. But the thing is that Israel has revealed itself to be superior both in a military and an intelligence sense, and yet we still look at October 7 and say to ourselves, how the hell did that happen? I mean, it wasn't 9/11. Yeah. The Israelis were never that disorganized. From their intelligence services, if you compare what happened in America prior to 9/11, where none of their intelligence services were sharing information or talking to each other, they all had bits and pieces of intelligence. They all had pictures of the bad guys who were going to pull off this monumental feat of terrorism, but no one could actually say, yeah, this is going to happen. Let's stop these guys before they board the planes. Israel's never had that sort of disaster in terms of its intelligence organizations, as far as we know, because a lot of what they do is classified anyway. But assuming that they are a perfectly run organization, or at least as close to humanly possible, and they have shown that they can actually pinpoint and assassinate people in foreign climates and areas. I mean, even as far as downtown Tehran, when they killed Hamas leader Haniyeh when he was visiting Tehran. I mean, that's amazing stuff. I mean, truly amazing. But yet the question remains, with all of that skill, where were they all on October 7?
Yeah. Is that a conspiracy theory, John? I don't know. Listen, thank you very, very much. You're wonderful, as usual.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Jeremy.
All the best.
Bye now.